in an hour or two. Should be
What's
pretty good.
up?
Hey, Kiza-chan. How's it going?
Oh, it's going.
That's pretty good. Hey, sorry for being a few minutes late here. I'm just kind of cleaning up a little bit.
You're good.
Um,
I'm still doing a little bit of like sound testing and stuff for Twitch.
oh, I got you. Okay. Yeah, it's cool. Take your time. So I'm hoping just to start detailing to keep this like it's just natural conversation format. So meaning that the type session itself, there's no like determining like processes or rituals that we need to go through in a sense. Like the goal is not to make it seem like it's that we're sitting in the chair at Regis Philbin and it's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and there's a pulsating soundtrack in the background with the lights all aimed at center stage or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You mentioned it would be more like conversational.
Yeah, I just it's kind of discussing whatever, whenever, and like along the way, like kind of picking up on preferences, ideals, values, points of view and reasoning, why things occur. I'm just seeing the general trend in thought and action.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense
it
to
should be
me.
cool. Yeah.
Let's see.
How's it like? What's the whole setting up for Twitch process? Like, is that like a difficult thing to do sometimes?
It can be. I kind of have a setup for this already, so I should be almost done.
Good old Twitch. Not a big Twitch user. Not for any reason. I just haven't used Twitch a lot.
Yeah, I try to use it more often. I kind of slack on my streams. I don't
Do you
know.
like when you say you slack on your streams? Like, you just don't do a lot of them, or?
I have certain days that I mean to stream, and I don't know. I get tired, and I don't manage my time well, and so a lot of times it doesn't end up happening.
I see.
All right, as long as the audio is good, should be set up.
Alrighty. Sweet. So yeah, I guess to finish the point about Twitch, it seems pretty cool. Maybe I should get a little bit more involved. It just seems like a rabbit hole of like tons of different content creators that differ from YouTube, and I'm already kind of wrapped in YouTube. But uh, it seems like a good place to kind of record some things and keep them for the future in some sense.
Yeah, I hope to get partnered eventually. So we'll see
That'd be
if
pretty cool.
if I can be more consistent. That's the key.
Yeah. Do you like run on a schedule? Like, do you have like do you put down like I'm making a stream every Wednesday or something like that?
Um,
Like a routine?
I used to publish it, but I stopped publishing it because I feel like I'm letting people down more than anything when I don't follow through.
Hmm.
I need to get time management down and a little bit of discipline.
I hear you. Alrighty. So yeah. So we're here for a few reasons, but um I guess right now under the umbrella of John Bebee is the system that we're using to get you a personality typing to get that done. So I just kind of a spitball here. Like, do you know anything about John Bebee? It's like it's fine if you do. It's fine if you don't.
um,
Um,
I think everything I know from John Bebee has is only stuff that I gathered from C.S. Joseph. I haven't
mhm,
actually read John Beebe's books quite yet.
I getcha. Yeah. I would say like the majority of information that floats around through word of mouth is most of the times pretty like it's digestible in some sense. It's like nutritious, so to say. It's not like bad information if you were to consume it. And he's mainly known, from what I can tell, uh, the signature um, ideas that he brought forward are mainly the 8 function whole type model as a development from MBTIs. And so that means, like, think MBTI 4 function model doesn't use the application of functions within its system, but then John Bebee did an 8 function whole type model. It used cognitive functions and incorporated the shadow. So that's the general evolution of, or from, MBTI that Beebe ended up being known for.
Hmm.
The 8 function model itself too is known for the cognitive slots as well. So I'm assuming you've heard of the hero, the parent, the child, the inferior, the opposing, critic, trickster, and demon.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with those terms as far as they come from C.S. Joseph's channel.
hmm yeah, those terms are John Beebe's system of how he labeled the cognitive slots in his 8 function model. So the utilization of Beebe's system is going to be 8 slots in which you plug in the functions, and those slots are named after those labels. And those labels are looked into, dissected, and further investigated in his book, which kind of narrates a few different perspectives on what they may look like when those slots are activated and a person acts out a function that is in a certain slot. So, in ENTP or an ESTP would play out introverted thinking as a responsible parent function, for example. And the idea is that if we were to apply a perspective that works with um, communication in people, that we would see their position in their introverted thinking as trying to be responsible in their intention, and that there's a value placed upon providing introverted thinking, regardless of the nature of how strong it can be, right? Due to introverted feeling, sometimes, and depending on if it's an ESTP or ENTP, introverted feeling will be in a maybe blind spot, and the cost of that thinking, so that thinking will show up and maybe brutally get in your face a little bit. It's like, whoa, what's this? But that's what the functions and the slots try to provide, is an insight toward what someone may be doing with their thinking. I think that's the general gist
Mhm.
of where Beebe's model tries to go and tries to present itself in some sense.
They're
So,
cognating.
welcome to the stream, Overseer.
Yeah, we're also live on Twitch.
Oh, we're on Twitch.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
Okay.
um, from that point of view, now that I've given you a little bit of the dynamics of the BB model, it's also called the spine model. So you might hear the word spine a lot. Um, the reason, I think, well, there's a bit of a backstory, but I'll try not to get so thick into the backstory and kind of keep it simple. Um, there was a concept that evolved over time. Jung found it himself. He called it the human line. The human line was placed between the dominant and the inferior function. It was investigated, it was analyzed, it was spoken about at workshops to other analysts, and that human line was gathered by other analysts, was discussed in their books, um, was renamed a plumb line, a plumb being a carpenter's term for a straight vertical axis that is a simple line, and tries to basically say that this is the space between these 2 functions, the dominant and the inferior. Like, what is that? There's some kind of space here that is vertical.
Hmm.
So BB ended up calling that the spine. He relabeled the concept himself. So as it gets recycled, um,
Very fitting, because the spine.
mhm,
Jung was a very taxonomic thinker, and it's a syllogistic sort of. Well, it's sort of when you draw parallels in like an Aristotelian sort of way almost, uh, Jung would be sort of following a long tradition of taxonomic uh, making sense of the world. Sorry, I've got an apple. I've got bits of apple in my throat.
I see. Yeah, it's the evolution of such an idea was probably founded by Jung through his own investigation of,
So,
I guess,
what do you call it?
gets
A
into
spine.
epistemology.
Yeah, a spine would. If you call it the spine, you're sort of um, you're connecting it back to vertebrate.
Right. I think it's a pretty good reference because,
Mhm,
everyone has a spine and it's something internal in some sense. I mean, sometimes I think of
mhm,
archetypical impressions as the veins that you produce from near your wrist. And it's kind of fitting because
mhm,
if we're talking about such an idea of an impression coming from within, such as like an archetype or like, when someone acts out like the crazy principal, it's like, well, what does a crazy principal do? Well, he's producing some kind of image from himself that we can get small snapshots of,
Hmm.
but everything transitions into the next moment and it fades away. So the
mhm,
spine is interesting because it's something that we reference and we look within towards, and I guess that's where we look for these supposed functions that are going to inform us a bit more. So we look to the same place as to not get lost with the reference, which makes it useful.
Right.
Yeah.
So are you typing me using John Bebee, or do you have your own system that you call slope?
So what slope is the development of John Bebee. So in order to understand slope, John Bebee would have to be, it's basically built off of the foundation. So to say, if John Beebe's system is an RPG sandbox game, you are in a
this is
world
a mod.
of John Beebe. Slope is the downloadable expansion
Yeah.
onto the game. It's kind of like if you played Morrowind, the Tribunal expansion. It adds a portion of the map. It's not really a portion of the map. It's the island that pops up in the top right corner that one can sail to as an option. So it doesn't really affect the code that is of John Beebe. Like the mechanics they're actually all the same. So I'm glad you asked that question too, because what slope
Mhm,
is, it's a reinvention of the visual model of how to view the spine. So basically, if I were to explain that the spine is seen as a cross as drawn by Beebe himself. So in his book, he has this cross, and then he has an opposing cross for the shadow, and one sits maybe to the top right, and one sits to the bottom left. They intersect at points because it's trying to portray as if a sun is hitting the first cross and casting the shadow of the second cross behind it. And on each end of the cross, the top and the bottom would be the head and the tail of the spine, and then the arms that go across, which is another concept that's a part of the spine, would label the functions that would be like the second and third function. I guess I can leave a picture for you.
Yeah, I would love this.
In
I would love a picture. Yeah.
Got you, cool. Because I just posted one recently, so I should have one handy. Let me see here. I think it helps provide that understanding that I'm mentioning without complex descriptions that might confuse. Here we are. So I'll leave it in typing chat here. So this is the BB figure that a lot of people know and understand his 8-function cognitive slot model for. And the thing about it is, um, as for a visual, it does help. It does provide some structure for what's happening. It helps organize things in a symmetrical fashion. So to say, like, there's a symmetry between, if we look at egosyntonic on the left and basic orientation, which is the first to the fourth function, and then it looks the same as the right. So it's visually pleasing, um, but in some sense, um, how this looks doesn't help understand how a personality type fits into it. And what I mean by that is this 1 through 8 model of two different figures only explains what the cognitive slots are. So, to understand a personality type within the model, there's no actual visuals um, that help produce a understanding that can be aided with such a visual aid. So essentially, the model was redrawn. It wasn't two crosses. The goal was to redraw an image that was going to help create a better visual understanding of how the mechanics were to work. Because as we sit where we are now and look at this, the mechanics work for the system. They just don't come as naturally to some people, I would say, and that there's an easier way to begin applying the understanding of John Bebee and his concepts, such as the spine, which would be once again the top bottom function, or the first, fourth, fifth, eighth. So there's the spine and then the shadow of the spine. Then the arms, which is the father, mother, or the auxiliary function, or the child function, or the puer, or the tertiary function. And then there's the shadow arms, which would be the senex witch and the trickster, known as the critic sometimes and the trickster. So what slope essentially is something that attempted to recreate how an ability to see the shifts between the cognitive slots would work. So what I mean by that is in John Beebe's model, when it comes down to one of the 8 slots, if we were to plug in a personality type, a person engages and embodies the strategy at times of a particular 1 through 8. So depending on how they see a situation, the understanding that they've accumulated over time, how they judge the situation, to how they wish to present themselves towards that situation, be it for personal, social, or rational or logistical reasons. Like there's tons of different ways in which a person can decide to approach a situation, but the idea is that they're confined to only one of these 8 strategies in their presentation. And the idea is to calculate and measure and to track down which one of the 8 that a person is consistently within, and
Mm.
that moves over time. It's kind of like, I know you're a Pokemon player. It's kind of like when you're trying to catch the rare dogs in Pokemon Silver and Gold, like um, Suicune and Ryoku, and they keep like the moment you find one and you don't catch it with the ball, it flees and it goes to a different area of grass, and you have to look at your Pokédex and see where it went.
Yeah.
Kind of like that, a little bit like that, which is pretty cool. And so, a person pops up out of nowhere. It's kind of like whack-a-mole, and then you got to figure out exactly where they're popping up next, in some sense. And there's no real pattern to what will show up next unless you grow some rapport with a person, befriend them, find out their values, and discover who they are as a person, which is a very long, complex process for any person. And then maybe using the system as a psychoanalytic tool to assume what is to come, and the probability of that seems much, much easier than it does in the beginning here when it's not promised at all. It just helps kind of identify and finding the right intention and the right perspective that a person might be presenting. So I find it as like a, a proof, or some kind of I'd say the right word is a confirmation of what someone might mean, but at times too it can also be applied as a band-aid to where when someone approaches a situation and nothing seems to make sense. It's as if, not to say it's a prescription, but there are times where people are in an unhealthy state of mind, and then there's an optimal way in which or not an optimal way, there's an ideal way in which someone can optimize who they are and their aptitudes and what they're good at potentially. It's not really what a person's good at. It's what a person can see. And the
Mhm.
idea is that if a person can see a certain something, that they can be good at that certain something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're good at it. But you want to lead people towards what they can see. That way they have a sense of clarity about something. And I think that's what this model tries to prescribe in some sense. Did you have any questions at this point? I know I've been kind of going through a lot of information, so I just want to kind of do the check-in, maybe take a second to, you know,
I don't think so.
all right, you're catching on pretty quick.
I mean, it's hard to say how well I'm actually catching on until later we find it's almost like we find out what I haven't grasped or not.
I gotcha. Okay. I guess to finalize exactly, the original question, like what is the slope aspect of this now? Um, when we think of a ladder of functions, and I'm going to put in maybe another picture. I might have one that's um, acceptable and quickening up the explanation here to make it like only 2 minutes instead of anything longer. Let's see. This PC. Okay, so this kind of helps out a little bit, I think. So I'm mainly posting this image because of um, the nature of 8 blocks on top of each other. So
Is
the
that
idea of what?
in typing?
Oh yeah, that's gonna be in the typing chat. Hopefully that helps speed up the idea of the the nature of what exactly happens. So if we look at the idea of these following images, what they try to do is it explains how there's a hero, parent, child, aspirational, opposing critic in a more ladder-like fashion. And the ladder-like fashion helps out. It doesn't really change the structure of anything. What it does is it provides um, an easier to understand top-down order, which isn't a hierarchy, it's a preferential order, so from
Mm-hmm.
most preferred to least preferred. And in some sense, the idea in slope is that when you, as a person, as we relay these um, different cognitive slots or archetypes, as Beebe would state them to be, um, the idea is that we pair them up in a sense. And what I mean by that is my original example was using ETPs. They have a dominant function that's perceiving, which is followed by a second function, which is a judgment function. And the idea is that when, say, we'll use an ESTP for example, when they use their extroverted sensing, that is coupled with a function such as introverted thinking. So it's kind of like a buddy system. Extroverted sensing would go with introverted thinking, and then because it's a perception dominant personality, the next one would be extroverted feeling and introverted intuition, but introverted intuition would come first. And so if we reorganize this little buddy system of functions, we place them into a 2 by 2 grid, what kind of happens here is we start to see a pattern of, so extroverted sensing leads the top left quadrant with introverted thinking underneath it. The top right quadrant leads with introverted intuition. Why? Because it's an extroverted sensor, it's a perceiver. Introverted intuition underneath it in the buddy system, extroverted feeling. And then in the bottom left quadrant, it would be introverted sensing and extroverted feeling. Not extroverted feeling, excuse me, introverted sensing and extroverted thinking. So those two would be a buddy system in the bottom left, and then in the bottom right, with the final two functions of extroverted intuition and introverted feeling. And when that happens, we don't really change the mechanics of BB system. We're still looking for how someone produces one of those cognitive slots. So if it's an ESTP, we'll look for the, say, the child function. And if that comes out, we know that's extroverted feeling. And the idea is that we'd go to the image in the top right box in that quadrant model, and we'd look at the introverted intuition, extroverted feeling way in which it's organized. And the reason we split it up into 2 by 2, I didn't really leave an image there that filled in the blanks there and exposed more of the the nature of what it would look like. I think I do have something here that I can actually provide
That would be
and throw
amazing.
in. So we'll do an ENTP here. So it's going to start to look familiar, but the mechanics and the way it's built, I built it off of BB's book himself. So this would be an ENTP. So if you look at the top, I want you to look where it says the actual type. It says the NTP. Any and TI are underneath it. And if you look at the top right for
Mhm.
ISFJ, SI and FE. And so what I've done so far is I've only separated the slots into a buddy system of 2 in the top left, 2 in the top right. But the logic of the way the system works, because it works in a dualistic sense, and because Beebe was um, the advocator for axis, the functions being on an axis, we understand that extroverted intuition as a dominant function is on an axis with introverted sensing. So we
Mhm.
can plug in introverted sensing, and we understand that TI is on an axis with extroverted feeling. And then we understand what the shadow of that might look like. So there's a little dash there that indicates the separation, and then the shadow. So the consequence that logistically follows with the system is that we get 4 stacks of 8 in each one of these quadrants. And so now you can see how it's evolved from just an 8 function stack separated into a quadrant, and then how how that unravels like a curtain
Mhm.
that's been undone in some sense. And so now that we're here at this point, um, there's a let me see here. The reason that this is allowed is because there's a portion in Beebe's book. So there was a page, I believe it's on page 166. It's hard to really forget the page. And on page 166 in Beebe's book, he talks about specifically there being 4 positions of consciousness. And without getting too in depth and too technical, I think I can easily state that if I can actually grab the picture, I can just pretty much circled like a little box that he wrote and a little graph that he drew. But actually, let me just see really quick. So we'll just go grab it really quick. 166. And maybe it's a little bit different in this one I have on the computer. Essentially, superior inferior, here we go. So I'll leave this picture in the chat and I'll kind of read it really quick. I think it helps explain why this kind of model or the way in which it's been laid out on the picture is allowed. So, and this is on page, what page was this in the PDF? My PDF might be zoomed in a little bit, so the page is probably different. But if you have the BB book, you can find it at any given time. This is going to be page. I think this is 177 here, so I think it's because it's zoomed in. But he talks about his contribution. My primary contribution to the deeper understanding of Jung's typology was to ask and to try to answer the question: if the functions in these positions, inferior and superior, are tied as they seem to be, which is the spine, that like the original human line we talked about that evolved over time,
Mhm.
to specific archetypes in the psyche, to what archetypes are the functions and the positions linked? So this is where he linked together and tied something together for the spine. And so his studying over time led him to, and this is where he kind of exposes that he's been practicing for 50 years in psychotherapy. And this is based off of his expertise in the field, if anything, that he found 4 positions of consciousness to be at the core of the individual self, which is the superior function, the inferior, the shadow of the superior, and the shadow of the inferior.
Is that
And
similar to the subconscious, unconscious, and superego?
it is. There would be no superego in the slope system, at least. Well, I mean, there would be. There's quadrants and gears. So you'd be in the first, second, third, or fourth gear, which is
Mm.
the same thing as the ego would be the first gear. The second gear you'd be in would be the subconscious or the persona. The third gear would be the shadow or the unconscious, and the fourth gear would be that superego which you speak of.
Okay, so it's kind of reminiscent
Mm.
in a way.
It is, but this is built specifically off of the understanding and interpretation here from Beebe's book, where I'm not really sure how the other model was built. It was never really specified, right?
Mhm.
And so, um, with the labels there, the superior, the inferior, the shadow of the superior, and the shadow of the inferior, if we go back to that picture right above, if we place those 4 functions at the top of each quadrant, we have the ability to place each one of the perception functions in the description here of an ENTP as follows. We can put any in the first top left. We can put SI in the top right because those are the representation of the 4 positions of consciousness. And then we pair them with their judgment function and then the consequences, the stacks. So now we're back in the game of 4 sides a little bit,
Okay.
but it changes up a little bit. So
Right.
and so essentially, instead of labeling, I mean, there's still a synonymous label of like ego, shadow, persona, but there's a concept of gears in slope, and the reason it's called gears, it tries to represent more of an analogy of how we switch modes of operation. Some people kind of look at it as a car, if they're car junkie. Where my car junkies at? Who's driving stick in here? So we got you can go in the first, second, third, fourth gear. It's like shifting the way in which one um, moves through a situation.
Right.
We move
I
at
think
different
it's actually a
speeds.
really good analogy.
Oh, awesome. I'm glad you're able to see it quite well. That was hopefully the goal, is to not confuse, because I always find ambiguity and confusion to be the enemy of understanding in some sense. And so these gears here, when we see this model, essentially we track John Bebee's understanding too. So as I was saying before, like we'll try to find like, oh, that looks like the critic function. And so if we find the critic function, we know that that's the sixth function for an ENTP. In this example, I know we were using ESTP before, but I put the wrong picture in there. So ENTP. Um, where would extroverted thinking be? Well, where do we place it in the model? We place extroverted thinking in the bottom left because it's the sixth function. It goes along with the fifth function. So we would jump to the bottom left and we'd look at this makeup of a way of thinking. Because if someone's embodying extroverted thinking, they're repressing the diametric opposite extroverted feelings out of the equation. It went south of the equator. It and the axis of that function shows up too. So there's some kind of makeup here. Not all the functions go on vacation, and they all reorganize themselves in order to allow the presentation and the personification of this function and the slot to exist. And then we see a person in their critical nature, um, storming about and doing what they're doing in whatever critical way that it may be, and we simply monitor and we realize what that is. And so this is kind of like a tracking system in some sense. And so how I would type someone is that a lot of what they're going to provide, a lot of the reasoning that they give, a lot of the interpretation that they unveil as to the mystery of what's underneath the perspective is going to be placed into this model, and it's going to ping pong around. It's going to fly all over the place like a pinball machine. And certain situations, like the conflict with this person, the aspirations in this category towards this goal, the difficulty at this point in time with this task, um, the great times I had with these people and items. Um, like maybe we had a car at one point, it was great. Each one of those is going to fit into this cognitive narrative and way of thinking, and it'll produce an understanding through one of these 4 ways in which thought can be produced. It's not just one of 4 ways. There's a multiplicity of ways in which one of these little gears can produce different ways of being you and thinking about something. But the idea is that a lot of the stories and narratives and things that you'll speak on will be dragged and dropped into the so-called folder of each one of these 4 corners, and something's going to make sense and stick. And the problem with the system is that it's a self-correcting system. So if one, you know, if we're in like a different type and we're trying to drop things in, something's not going to stick and it's not going to make sense. It's not going to ping pong around. It's going to get really rackety. It's not going to be smooth. And then when we place it inside another, there's going to be something that's so locked in. It's like there's like a it's trackable in some sense. and it kind of brings to light like a kind of understanding of the person, to where, say if there's like deep gridlock in certain relationships, and anxieties and worries in different areas and different people's houses, and things aren't going right, or if there's complete confidence in certain areas, it's going to reveal ways of thinking, and like which way and which gear is the person thinking about this situation in. And the idea is that once that's exposed, try one of the other gears. Then you realize, like, oh, like I see the cognitive trap I'm in by looking at the type and how they think. And then I realize that I can decide to not think like that because I'm aware of what I'm stuck in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense.
Sweet. So from here, I've explained some things about slope. Hopefully, that explained things pretty well. Um, but for now, we can just we can free for all it. It's